the webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Reddy, for first organizing this wonderful platform. You have really turned the pandemic issue into a platform where all barriers are broken and people from different countries, from different continents are able to participate, share knowledge, especially the young faculty. Thank you very much for doing that. And thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. Very, very happy to be here with this morning for North America and evening for Asia. So I shall start my presentation and I hope I am audible. I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, you are.
Good, thank you. The title is a bit unusual in the sense, when you are flashing so many topics, groundwater, contamination. I mean, of course, we build a landfill so that our groundwater is safe. But we don't usually go beyond that and see. We see our landfill is working okay, but we don't really focus much on the groundwater quality as such. That is because as geotechnical engineers, geoenvironmental engineers, what is a few meters below the soil is of interest to us, about 10 meters. Beyond that, we say, okay, somebody else's. But then India has a very, very strange problem, as true for many developing countries, where we depend on the groundwater a lot for agriculture, for drinking, for industries. So during my course of research, you as Professor Reddy mentioned that you look at different aspects. The groundwater quality was one of the aspects that sort of caught our attention, and we have been working on it since almost 20 years. So some of the results and findings I'll share with you. So as the title says that we are trying to examine as to how the aquifer of a small town got contaminated by nitrate and by on-site sanitation. Possibly this topic is a bit offbeat for many of the listeners. So what I shall do is I shall try to give a brief outlines, brief introduction as we go along, so that people are not completely lost. Yeah. So when we look at the water resource, okay, I have to go back. Yeah. When you look at the water resource, as we see, 97% is sea, 2.4 is glaciers, and 0.6 is only the fresh water. Along with the surface water, we also have the groundwater. That is the water that saturates the spaces between the alluvial materials, crevices, fractures in rocks, aeration zones, and so on and so forth. I don't know if my figures on the right are visible. You have two pictures there, one of a shallow well, many of you would have seen, and one is of a tube well or a bore well, as we say in the country, that taps water from a deeper depth. So if you want to look for the upper figure, it usually taps the water from the soil and from the upper region of the weathered zone. But what much of the country depends is on the tube well, that goes right into the weathered and fractured zone and the hard rock. So obviously, India and many Africa and many of the developing nations started tapping the groundwater because they felt that the water is clean. We don't have to worry about contamination like fecal contamination and so on and so forth. So 1980s, there was a very big push. 1990s, what happens is when you are sort of dealing with water at such a large depth, it interacts with the rocks, it interacts with the rock minerals, and it throws up some curveballs at you. For example, 1990s, I think arsenic in West Bengal and Bangladesh is a very famous case that I think many people would have heard of. You also have problems of fluoride. And then, of course, as you keep on dumping waste, your aquifer keeps getting contaminated if you're not doing a good job of it. So if you look at a snapshot of the water resources in the country, surface water is about 690 billion cubic meters. And groundwater, surprisingly, is touching 432 billion cubic meters. It's almost rubbing shoulders with the surface water consumption in the country. The next slide is much more interesting. Now, if you look at the water, groundwater, out of 432 billion cubic meters, 330 billion cubic meters is used by agriculture, and about 70 billion cubic meters is used by domestic and industry in the country. So, you would have heard that India is agriculture centric country. So much of the water resources goes towards the agriculture. Now, I want to focus today's talk on the quality aspects of groundwater, and just reading a statement that it serves as a decentralized source of safe water for the reasons I had mentioned for millions of rural and urban people, accounts for nearly 80% of rural domestic water needs and 50% of the urban water needs of India. Just yesterday, I saw a snapshot in the newspaper here in Bangalore. It says that more than 200 crore people live in countries experiencing high water stress. And India, I mean, very sorry to read this, 120 out of 122 countries ranking, we are in the bottommost. And then it says 75% of households across the globe do not have access to drinking water on the premises, and 40% of the people will not have access to clean drinking water by 2030. So besides quantity, I mean, availability of water, quality is also a very important issue. And one of the quality aspects is what I shall be focusing on my talk as we go ahead. Now, when we speak of water quality, it has three attributes: physical, chemical, and biological. Physical parameters are color, what is supposed to be colorless. So if there is a bit of a color, you say, oh, the water is not good. Odor, what is supposed to be odorless. And if there is some smell, okay, you feel there is something fishy. Turbidity, again, what is supposed to be clear. And if it is turbid, it means you have some kind of suspensions in your water. You will not drink that water. And temperature, usually it is supposed to be at room temperature unless it is refrigerated. So if it is hot, then you know that there is some problem with the source of the water. Physical parameters are very easy to identify because if there is color, if there is odor, there is turbidity, you can very easily make out. The problem comes with chemical parameters, which we cannot see. So the major chemical parameters are pH, alkalinity, bicarbonates and carbonates, hardness, you must have heard this term, hard water, soft water, and dissolved solids, like I'll come to this. And then you have the harmful chemicals. The landfills are trying to protect the aquifers from heavy metals, nitrates, and organics. Heavy metals and organics, I would say, is the main forte of the landfills. But you have these problems of nitrates, arsenic, and fluoride. Arsenic and fluoride is, what shall I say, naturally occurring groundwater because of geogenic reasons. I'll focus on that. And then you have nitrate, that's again an anthropogenic reason that is coming into being. Now, just to give you a brief idea, that is, suppose you take a bottle of water, what is it composed of? It is composed of sodium ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions, sulfate and bicarbonate ions. These are mainly coming by the interaction of the water with the lithosphere. It could be the surface soil, or it could be the rocks. And then you have minor ions, that is 0.01 to 10 milligrams per liter, iron, fluoride, arsenic, strontium. Some few names are given here. They are very small in quantity, but they are the most problematic. I shall dwell more on this in a couple of slides. Now, each country has got its own, what shall I say, drinking water standard. Many of these countries, and I mean, most of the countries derive them from the WHO guidelines, the World Health Organization guidelines. In India, we have what is known as the BIS 10,500. I have given only a few of the parameters here just to sort of focus on it. There are about 40 parameters, but I'm not listing all of them. Now, if you look at, as I go down the table, chloride, calcium, magnesium, sulfate, the values, there are two limits, acceptable limit and permissible limit. The meaning of that is, actually, I mean, you would like the water to have this quality, but if there is no other source, a higher contamination could be tolerated. I mean, that is the meaning of it, acceptable limit and permissible limit. So if you look at, say, TDS, that is the dissolved salt concentration, it says the water should be less than 500 milligrams per liter. But if you have no choice, you can drink water up to 2 grams per liter. That is very, very tough, actually. So the lakes and the fresh water and the rivers that we have, Usually the dissolved salts is about 300 milligrams per liter. So you don't feel the salinity, but sometimes, if you were to travel somewhere, you would feel that the water is salty, and that is because of your dissolved salts. Now you can look at chlorides, 250 to 1000, very large. Calcium, 75 to 200. And that calcium and magnesium is mainly the hardness causing problems. And then you have this nitrate, which is 45 milligrams per liter, and which is my focus of the talk as to, this is more of a, what shall I say, in India at least, a recent this thing as to how it is occurring and the implications on the health. Now, if you look at fluoride, 1 milligram per liter, arsenic 0.01 milligrams per liter, lead 0.01 milligrams per liter, cyanide 0.05 milligrams per liter, cadmium 0.003 milligrams per liter. And strangely, India does not note benzene, which is much more toxic than many of the elements, but this I took from US EPA, it's 0.005 milligrams per liter. So, I mean, presence of say 0.005 milligrams per liter, we cannot even detect unless you have a very sophisticated GCMS with you. You cannot detect 0.003 milligrams per liter of cadmium in your water unless you have a ICP-MS with you. So these elements are present in such small concentrations. You can't smell, you can't see, you can't taste them. But then you drink them, you fall sick. Cyanide is known to be instantly lethal. Others will have, you fall sick for a period of time. Arsenic, you feel sick for a period of time. Likewise, fluoride. Many of these elements are, of course, carcinogenic in nature, like for example, benzene. Just giving you this to put in things in perspective for you as to how water quality is impacted. Now, what are the sources of pollution of the water? There are two broad classes, as we say, anthropogenic, that is because of the human activities, and geogenic, because of the interaction of the water with the rock. Now, if you look at the anthropogenic or the human, you have different classes. The domestic pollution, where we dispose our sewage. The agriculture pollution, where you have the pesticides, the nutrients, and the fertilizers. Of course, industrial pollutions, many of us are aware of it, disposal of effluents. And then you have the geogenic variety, that is because of the interaction of the water with the rock. So very prominent examples are arsenic, fluoride, iron, and of course salinity. The nitrate has been wrongly listed here. Nitrate is because of a combination of two aspects, domestic pollution and agriculture pollution. It doesn't come because of geogenic activities. Nitrate in natural groundwater is very, very less than a milligram per liter, and it is harmless. But when you have domestic pollution and agriculture pollution, the things become bad. So today's talk is on a small town, as I said, Mulabagal. It's about 95 kilometers from Bangalore, not very far. It's a small town, area is about 8.5 square kilometers, and it has been divided into 25 units. And as you can see the picture on the right, it is like any small town. You have very bad unpaved roads, chaotic traffic, political banners, and so on and so forth. The beauty of this town is it depends on groundwater for its drinking water needs completely. There is no surface water, and it has no, what shall I say, sanitation that is there in many of the developed nations and the urban centers of the country. That is known as off-site sanitation. I'll come to that. It depends completely on on-site sanitation. That is, I will explain what is off-site and on-site sanitation. So it has got on-site sanitation, and it has got groundwater acid source of this thing. Very lethal cocktail, as we shall see in the next slides. So the town is very small and not very large, about 9,000 houses. And there are about 18 slums or shanties, and there are about 10 community toilets. Most of them are non-functional, so open defecation is very rampant. So about 8,000 households have what is known as the pit toilets. I will just come to that. Population is about 60,000, so about 5 people per house. That's the kind of population you have. And the drinking water that they extract from the groundwater is about 5 million liters per day. So it's a very, very, very huge number that they're pumping from the ground. Now, I will just try to explain as to what is off-site sanitation and on-site sanitation. Basically, off-site sanitation means a sewer network that you're aware of. and a centralized wastewater treatment plant. Now, construction of a sewer network needs high investment. About 65% of the total investment is required for the sewers. And if, I mean, this may be a surprise to you what's new in this, but it is new for many developing nations and for many households in the villages. If you have in-house tap water, then the demand is about 100 liters per day per capita. That is, in flushing the toilet, we spend about 100 liters per day per person. And minimum flush is about 30 liters per toilet flush. Benefits, there are of course benefits, high removal of organic matters, nutrients and bacteria. It is suited for urban areas and the space required is about 0.5 to 2 square meters per person. Disadvantage is high cost, investment and operation, highly skilled people, high water demand, and of course large investments and large machinery. And the source is from this website that I have given above. Compared to that, you have what is known as the on-site sanitation. Basically, it means you have a house and you have a toilet and a pit, and the pit is where all the human waste is disposed. So adequate space for locating the toilet and the leach pits, that is the pits from where the waste water will go into the ground. Advantages, it is simple to construct, operate and maintain, less expensive. I think the government of India has got the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and 3,000 rupees is the cost of constructing one such toilet. And the aim of the government is to see that open defecation is completely wiped out. And I think as of today, about 90% of the country is covered by this pit toilet system or the on-site sanitation facilities. Of course, disadvantage is the possibility of pathogens leaching into the groundwater and contaminating it, because you're dumping the waste in the ground, you're not treating it. So you are, of course, going to contaminate it, as we shall see in the set of slides. So most popular are the twin pit toilets, that is, you have two kind of holes. If one gets filled, you flush it and connect to the next. That is what is done. Or you can have a septic tank. That's popular in many countries and many places. So as you can see here, pit toilets not only in India, but it meets about 1.77 billion people around the world. And they use pit toilet as a primary source of sanitation. As you can see here, you have the toilet and you have got the pit. The human waste is dumped here. The solids will remain and the liquids will sort of flow. And then you have got the aquifer and they have got a possibility of getting contaminated. Now, black water is basically human excreta, that is the fecal matter plus urine and the water that we use for flushing. So again, more elaboration on that. Contaminants released from the leach pit. As you can see, the flow lines, they flow from the leach pit and eventually hit the groundwater. And that is our problem. And that is our problem that the country and many countries that have this kind of system are facing, whether it is Africa. And also, surprisingly, you have parts of the North America, you have parts of the Europe, where you have isolated communities and they depend on this. And then you have this problem that they're also facing. So this is a snapshot of a picture of what is known as what is happening in that particular town. Some of the pictures I'll just focus here. Now on the y-axis, we have got known as the total dissolved solids. On the x-axis, we have the bore well or the tube well. And these are the numbers. Now there are two lines here. One is at 500 milligrams per liter. One is at 2 grams per liter, as I said. This is the desirable limit. This is the permissible limit. The pink triangles correspond to the tube wells within the town. The black squares correspond to the tube wells located outside the town. Now, since you have a concentration of the pit toilets that are releasing the black water into the subsurface soil, so there is a lot of contamination within the town compared to outside the town. Now, total dissolved solids is a measure of the amount of dissolved solids, dissolved ions in the water. And the limit is 500 milligrams per liter, as I mentioned before, but you can see that it is way above the mark. and some cases it has gone even about 2 grams per liter. And this water, uh, the people are very, very, very smart, resourceful. So when the government has spent a lot of money in putting these tube wells inside the town. There is a very high density. I don't have the number, but it's several hundreds of tube wells they have put. Practically every street or every alternate street has got a tube well. Now what has happened is a lot of money has gone into pumping and putting these tube wells. But when the people started drinking the water, they found it very salty. So automatically they stopped using this water. So when we went to the town and asked them, what do they do with the water? What with the government has spent so much money? They said, no, we don't drink this water. Use it only for secondary purpose, like for washing and so on and so forth. They will depend on the water from outside for their potable needs. So people develop their own defense mechanisms against contamination. Just a very common sense approach. You find the water is not good. It is not smelling, but it is tasting bad, tasting salty. So they feel, okay, something is wrong with it. They had not tested it for nitrate. They're not tested for E. coli, but that's their gut feeling that there is something wrong with this water. They say it is called as kharab pani, bad water. We will not touch this water. So it is only used for secondary purposes. So just to give you a snapshot as to how bad the concentration of the ions is, on the x-axis you have calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, and chloride, sulfate, bicarbonate, and nitrate. This is the water quality from the Mudbagal town, and the orange bars are from groundwater of IISc campus. And as you can see here, there is a vast difference between the non-contaminated water, that is IISc groundwater, and the contaminated water, that is the Mudbagal water. Here it is 150, it is less than 50. Here the chloride is about 350, here it is less than, just about 50. Nitrate is about 150, here nitrate is absent, and so on. So you can see. So, researchers had analyzed, from southern Thailand, the composition of human waste, and they're rich in nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, chloride. So what we eat is what we throw out, and eventually they sort of enter the groundwater if they're not treated properly. So this is an example as to what happens when you have the on-site sanitation facility where the human waste is not subject to the kind of wastewater treatment plants that we usually have. So this is the problem that we end up with. You also have the problem of the total coliforms and E. coli. So when we measured it, the values are very large in the groundwater within the town because the black water was sort of releasing all these E. coli into the groundwater. Now, we also looked at the nitrates. That is the focus of my talk. Why nitrates? Because I think nitrates is a contaminant that is associated with what is known as the blue baby syndrome. That is, what does nitrate do is it combines with the hemoglobin and forms a complex. So oxygen is not available to bind with the hemoglobin, and then the people get starved of oxygen. And then there is some, when you're starved of oxygen, you become blue in color. That's why it is known as the blue baby syndrome. I think also nitrates nowadays, the recent research says that it's also linked with carcinogenic and other human, long-term sicknesses. So it's not good to have in your drinking water beyond the permissible limit. Beyond the permissible limit, it's not good to have. The common thing is what is known as the blue baby syndrome, where the infants are derived of oxygen because nitrate will combine with the hemoglobins. So you can see that outside the town, it's not bad. It is less than 45 milligrams per liter for many of the wells. But when I come to within the town, you see it's so high. 45 is here. Many of the wells have crossed the limits for the drinking water inside the town. So of course, when we started the project, this was funded by one of the groups known as Argyem. They were doing the water management for this particular town, and they approached me to say, let us look at the water quality. So their suspicion was this is close to the Kolar district. You must have heard of the Kolar gold fields, some of you. It's close to a zone which is known for fluoride. So they were suspecting fluoride in the water. So they said, let us check if there is fluoride in the water. There's no fluoride, but there's a lot of nitrates and E. coli. So which was a very surprise for them and for us. So this study was a part of the support that was given by the Argyem Foundation to look at the water quality, groundwater quality of that particular town and groundwater management. So that was the focus of this 3-year project. And once you get interested, then of course you start looking into it, you put your PhD students onto this, and some very wonderful research comes, as I will be sharing with you. Now, I mean, you discharge black water, but how does black water get converted to nitrate is a question mark. So the human waste contains a lot of organic nitrogen, and there are two kinds of oxidation process, two kinds of degradation process. Anaerobic, you must have the term, absence of oxygen, and aerobic, that is the oxidation that takes place in presence of oxygen. So when the human waste is dumped in the pit, there is no oxygen there, and the organic nitrogen gets converted to what is known as the ammonium ions. So I will come to this point. And when the black water is leached into the subsurface soil, you have got oxygen, and it will oxidize to form nitrate ions. Now the specialty of nitrate is it is very weakly absorbed by the soil particles. There are two reasons. One is the soil particles are negatively charged, so they have a inherent repulsion for the anions, and the anions will go through unless there is a strong complex formations like say sulfates and phosphates are bound to clay minerals. But anions like nitrates and chlorides easily pass through the soil particles because they don't have a specific bonding mechanism with the clay particles, so they simply travel through. That's why chloride is supposed to be an indicator. It's an indicator in groundwater transport. So likewise, nitrate doesn't bind, it simply passes through. So this happens when the black water hits the, what shall I say, the Weber zone or the subsurface soil or the unsaturated zone. It hits that zone, and then the transformation takes place. Now the human waste contains a lot of proteins and complex organic matters. They all degrade in the pit and form what is known as the urea. And the urease enzyme will form the ammonium ions along with some bicarbonate and hydroxyl ions. I will focus on these chemical reactions more in the next slide. But this is basically what is happening. You dump your waste in the pit. There is an anaerobic environment. It degrades to urea, and then urea in turn by the urease enzyme converts it to ammonium and bicarbonate ions. And once the ammonium ions hits the subsurface soil, it transforms to nitrate ions. So again, this is depicted here more clearly. You have the black water flowing out, and this is the active zone. You have the water table at a very large depth, and it keeps traveling, and of course there are some reactions happening here. I'll focus on that. So these are some of the governing reactions for nitrification. You have the nitrosobacteria that convert ammonium to nitrite, and then you have the nitrobacteria which converts nitrite to nitrate. Of course, not all the ammonium is converted to nitrates. Some of it undergoes volatilization, that is, they escape to the atmosphere as ammonia gas, and some of it is absorbed by the soil particles as ammonium ions, because ammonium ions again have a very strong affinity for the soil particles. One, because they are positively charged, and because they have got a small hydrated size. So as the hydrated size decreases, the affinity of the cation for the clay particles increases. So ammonium ions has got a specific bonding again with clay particles, so it is preferentially absorbed by the clay particles. So what one of my PhD students did along with my research team is they went actually to the location. I'll be discussing this in this thing. Picked up the black water from a live pit toilet, brought it to the lab and analyzed it. Now you can see that a couple of parameters I would bring your focus. One is the conductivity, that is very high, 4540 to 7000 microsiemens per centimeter divided by 1.54, that is milligrams per liter. The second point is the redox potential, minus 298 millivolts to minus 255, minus 198 millivolts. The median value is minus 255 millivolts. That is, what does it mean is there is no dissolved oxygen. It is anoxic or anaerobic character. There is no oxygen available in the black water. I mean, because the organic carbon is so high, everything is consumed. So your dissolved oxygen is low, 0.000 milligrams per liter. And as I said, you have got the urea. All the nitrogen, the organic nitrogen converts to urea. But surprisingly, there is no urea in the water. It's very, very small, 3.6 to 8.3. Median value is about 6 milligrams per liter. But then you see you have very large ammonium ions, 173 to 537 milligrams per liter. So the median was 321. So all your urea has got converted to ammonium ions. And because this is an anaerobic environment, there is no oxygen. Therefore, your nitrate is very, very low. It's ranging from 0 to 3.8 milligrams per liter. And of course, you have got the dissolved organic carbon that is ranging from 1000 milligrams per liter through 3,500 milligrams per liter. So rich in organic carbon, rich in ammonium ions, and anoxic in nature. That is the characteristic of the black water from a pit toilet that my research staff and research students had collected. So then we said, okay, let us, you cannot catch, there is no urea. So we were curious to see as to how does urea transform to ammonium ions. So what we did is we took the black water sample and spiked it with urea artificially. We spiked for different concentrations, say from 250 to 1000 milligrams per liter, and it at two temperatures, 25 degrees and 37 degrees, the kinetics. So you can see that as urea is decreasing, ammonia is forming, and this is the reaction that is taking place. So the time periods range from 8 hours to 16 hours. They are a function of the time, they are a function of the temperature, they are a function of the concentration. So this was a clear proof that, you have the black water, you spike it with urea, and within 8 to 12 hours or 16 hours, all the urea gets transformed to ammonium ions, and that is your source of ammonium in the black water. So we further did some examination as to what are the conditions, optimum conditions for the ammonification rate to take place. So for our conditions, we found that if we had taken 500 milligrams per liter and 37 degrees centigrade, the urease enzyme activity was optimum because you can see a peak here forming, which was not there at other concentrations and at other temperatures. So just we wanted to explore as to what are the optimum conditions under which these reactions do take place. Now, as I said that all of the ammonium ions do not transform to nitrate, because if it were to be so, then you would have thousands of milligrams of liter of nitrate in the groundwater. So there are three reactions. One is nitrification, that is this triangle, and then you have the volatilization. So you can see that the volatilization is the more preferred path because about 50% goes as volatile ammonia and about 20% gets transformed to nitrate ions. And interestingly, you can see that the nitrification begins only when the ammonia volatilization has stopped. That is, once this reaction stops, then this reaction stops. So also look at the other side reactions, the role of initial water content and so on. So this is the volatilization path for 50% initial water content specimen. And this is the cross is somewhere, the filled line, I'm not able to catch it, somewhere here for the nitrification path. So again, the same story comes. First volatilization and then nitrification. But what we see is only about 23 to 35% of the ammonium ions get converted to nitrates. This is because you have got low water content that is not conducive for the bacteria. They will dehydrate. And then you have got low oxygen content, dissolved oxygen content. So low dissolved oxygen contents, low bacterial activity are primarily responsible for the low conversion of ammonium to nitrate ions. So then we thought as to, with this knowledge, can we build this scenario in the Murubagar aquifer that we observed that was having very high nitrate contamination. So we did a lot of lab experiments. Now you transform the lab experiments to the field data. So whenever you have to extrapolate the lab to the field, you have to make a lot of assumptions. Some of the assumptions were based on the laboratory facts, and some of the assumptions had to be based on the census and so on and so forth. So the discharged black water can release about 40 milligrams of nitrogen. So our experiment said there is 23 to 35% conversion. So the black water concentration of ammonium ions we took, and 23% of that was 40 milligrams, and 35% of that was 188 milligrams of nitrogen can be released. So then if you assume that 60 liters is discharged, you then calculate per day, per year, per month, per number of households, and so on and so forth. Then we had the census data for this particular district, and we built the census data and we fitted an equation and said the population is growing so in this particular manner. We wanted to extrapolate to 1900, that is the beginning of the century. So we use this equation to build the population of the town, and then we had to sort of look at the aquifer data. So we looked at the geology of the aquifer. So basically it is fractured granite, gneiss, and schist, so 300-meter thick, and the depth is about minus 14 meters. We had measured it in one of our studies. So we calculated that if the town is having this kind of area and this is the kind of the depth, what is the storage capacity of the aquifer? We calculated that. A simplistic assumption, I will put some more assumptions. The other assumptions is the nitrate, we know that nitrate can arise from fertilizers also, but since we assume that all the nitrate is coming from the anthropogenic or the black water contamination, and the decadal population growth in the Mulbagal town is in accordance with the equation that we had formulated. Again, the number of persons we had said is 5, and we assume that you have only 5 people staying in a house throughout our calculations. It's a simplistic calculation, but there is in the absence of data, you have to always make some assumptions. And the volume of water available in the aquifer is constant throughout the computation period of about 100 years. So these are some of the sort of assumptions we had to make to calculate how the nitrate concentration in the aquifer has built up over a period of time. And when we did all that, we got 2 envelopes. One is for 23% conversion, that is the lower envelope, and the 35% conversion, that is the upper envelope. And what we did is we put all our data that we have measured in Mulbagal between this, and very nicely they are coming within this envelope. Some of them are close to the upper envelope, some of them are close to the lower envelope. Now, what does it say? Now, if there was 35% conversion, it means that in 1900 itself, that is 45 milligrams per liter of the permissible limit was breached. Okay, and if there was 23% conversion, somewhere in I think 2000, if you were to extrapolate, somewhere in 2010, the nitrate barrier has been breached. So I think the truth lies somewhere in between, But the interesting point is it takes nearly 100 years for 100 years or, between say 10 to 100 years, you can take a guess. It's very difficult to guess. It takes several decades, I would say, to be on the safe side for the aquifer to get polluted by the nitrate, by any leachates that is coming out of this thing. And that too, we have to remember that nitrate is not a very preferred ion, so it simply travels down. So one can sort of get a picture as to how many decades it has taken and what are the causes for the nitrate to contaminate the aquifer. So this data, there were at least 2 PhD students that worked on this. Several papers have come. There are several people have been associated with. I'll be listing all of them at the end of the presentation. But interestingly, the funding agency, that is Argyem Foundation, they were very, very keen. Okay, now we know that you have got the contamination of the nitrates. Is it possible to have measures that you can prevent the nitrate contamination in the aquifer? That is, you go to the source. Now, what is the source? The source is the pit toilet. What is happening is you simply have a pit and you do not have any kind of treatment facility there. It simply goes. Now, what our research has shown that there are 2 stages. You have ammonium, it goes to nitrate, and then the nitrate goes back to the aquifer. So we thought that is it possible to employ what is known as a biobarrier where you can denitrify the nitrates within the pit toilet. Is there a possibility? So we gave them a proposal and they said, fine, go ahead and have a look at it. So again, they funded us for 3 years. And then we first, as is usual, we did our research in the laboratory. Again, we had PhD students. Again, we had research students, research staff working with us. And once the concept was there, we went to the field. We identified, because we had a good relationship with the town, we went, identified a household food participate with us, put our specialized pit and monitored it for nearly 1 year or 2 years. I think we'll just look at these numbers to see whether our treatment is working. And here, all the geoenvironmental tools that we use came into place. Now, design and installation of the modified twin pit to mitigate the groundwater nitrate contamination. This is how, the pit is built. You have these concrete rings and then they install it. And then we did a lot of course, modifications, and I shall come to them. So this is our modified barrier. So you have the conventional anaerobic chamber. What we did is, you have the conventional pit where the water flows. We sort of sealed the bottom and the sides so that water cannot flow out anywhere, but it has to go to the next chamber. So this is our anaerobic treatment chamber where it undergoes anaerobic decomposition as in a conventional pit, but we do not allow the water to escape. We take it further and treat it. So what we did is, we then took it to the next chamber that is known as the aerobic chamber. We put an aerator. Actually, we installed an aerator there. If you can look at this, this is an aerator that we installed there. We had electricity supply there, so we installed an aerator, and then we ran the aerator so that all the ammonium gets converted to nitrate in the aeration chamber. And then when it's aerated, all the nitrate ammonium is converted to nitrate, then we allow it to pass to the chamber that is below this. So where we have got a biobarrier, that is, you have got a mixture. We used here a mixture of soil, sand, and cow dung, because cow dung has got a lot of denitrifying bacteria. So we said, let us try to prepare a barrier containing sand, because the water has to flow. And then you need a source of organic matter. So cow dung has a lot of organic matter and has a lot of denitrifiers. So I said, why not install it and see as to what happens. So when you do this, the water that is coming out is supposed to be clean water. So what is the proof? We installed these lysimeters all around, suction lysimeters, and we are sucking out the leachates and monitoring the quality in the laboratory to know how our barrier was working. So the next set of results, I will share you with that. So the first parameter is the chemical oxygen demand. We measured it for almost 365 days, that's for a year. So the upper circle is for the anaerobic chamber. As you can see that there is some time lag period, and then because of the anaerobic decomposition, the COD reduces, the chemical oxygen demand reduces. Then the next is the aerobic tank, where there is further conversion of ammonium to nitrate. Again, the bacteria use the organic carbon, so there is a further drop. And then we pass it to the biobarrier, and then it comes to the, what shall I say, the lysimeters L1 and L3, the suction lysimeters. You see it has dropped significantly. So likewise for ammonium, you see in the anaerobic chamber, because there is no oxygen, your ammonium concentration is almost constant. Then the aerobic tank, the ammonium is dipping. We had some problems with the aerators. Then when we modified the aerators, you can see the ammonium concentrations are decreasing quite nicely. There are some ups and downs because this happens in the field. The aerators don't work, it shoots up. So these are all live problems that one has to deal with. And then, when it comes to the biobarrier itself grabs some of the ammonium ions. There is some conversion. And then what we see in the lysimeters is, compared to this, is a very small concentration of ammonium escaping into the subsurface environment. Now, when you look at nitrates, of course, in the anaerobic tank, you're not supposed to have nitrates expected. In the aerobic tanks, you see you have got a lot of nitrate conversion, it's peaking. But when you look at the lysimeters, the biobarrier has converted the nitrates to nitrogen oxide. It has done the reverse of the nitrification, the denitrification reactions. So you see very less nitrates coming out from the what shall I say, the modified twin pit. So what we actually did is we did a decentralized wastewater treatment system in a very small pit, so that the purpose was that the aquifer that is being protected by the nitrate, and usually what happens is before this we had done the defluoridation also, where we were trying to remove the fluoride from the groundwater. Here we tried to run a experimental twin pit. Once the funding is over, of course, you have to dismantle. After 365 days, no money, the guys who are funding you say, well, your project is over. Nobody takes it forward, so you dismantle everything and bring it back to the laboratory. But very good learning, 365 days, it is doable, is the lesson that we learned. So when you do research, the question that the government or anybody throws at you is, what is the cost? Ultimately, the bottom line is how expensive it is, how doable it is. So we made a cost analysis, and if you were to conventional twin pit, that is without any of the technology, is about 12,400. But you do our intervention is about 18,000 rupees. That's about 6,000 rupees expensive. But of course, there is sophistication involved. There is some training involved, but not very expensive. But these are the kind of numbers that we came out with. We also shared it with this Jal Jeevan mission in the country, who are sort of responsible for the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. They were impressed, but they said, okay, we have finished 90% job. It's quite late, but well, that's how research goes. Of course, these were published. This was picked up by the media, and it was sort of shortlisted as one of the innovative toilet concepts for the urban India by IHQ WASH. And it featured in newspapers and other media also. Coming to the second last slide, of course, as I said, no research work is possible. I mean, you cannot work in isolation. You have to have a team. And these are the publications that come. And of course, in the publications, you see my co-authors also, my co-workers who have contributed to my research over my journey. And it has been a very nice journey. So we have been able to publish at least 2 PhD theses and a couple of good journal papers. So with this, I come to my end of presentation. And thank you very much for participating, for listening. And if you have any doubts or any queries, I shall be happy to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Sudhakar Rao, for your